and today we're going to be doing part 3 of my series, So You Think You Want to Read Adult High Fantasy, and in this one we're going to be talking about genre benders. So the idea of this video is if you typically read a particular genre, then I'm going to give you recommendations based off of that genre. So in the last video I talked about going from YA to adult, so it was more for people who read a lot of YA books. This one would be for other genres. So I typically read a lot of high fantasy, so that's like my main genre, but if you typically read a lot of historical fiction, maybe contemporary fiction, or sci-fi, or something like that, I'm going to give you recommendations to bridge the gap between that genre and high fantasy. So not all of the books in this video are going to be just solely high fantasy. A lot of them are going to be genre benders between whatever genre that I am talking about at the time and high fantasy, or they may be books from that genre that read very much like high fantasy, or the opposite, high fantasy books that read more like that genre. I may not be explaining this that well, but you'll get the idea once we get into the recommendations. If you like reading historical fiction, then I have to recommend you guys Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This is not high fantasy. This is very much just historical fiction. The reason why I recommend this is because it really feels like you're reading a high fantasy world while you're reading this book. There are zero fantastical elements in this book, but the world building and the complexities of this society really feel like one of those medieval high fantasy worlds, and it gets really political in some of the best ways possible. That a lot of political high fantasies have very similar setups to Pillars of the Earth. So if you like historical fiction and you're not sure if you like fantasy or not, I would definitely recommend Pillars of the Earth just to see if you like this type of world building, if you like this type of politics, and if you do, then you could potentially really love a lot of like the more medieval political high fantasies that are out there. This book is actually set in 12th century England, and it's about building a church, which it doesn't sound super interesting when you explain it that way, but it's actually truly fantastic. It's an absolutely brilliant novel that I would recommend to readers of both high fantasy and just historical fiction in general, because even though the subject matter doesn't seem that interesting, the complexities that the author brings into this and just the details of the world building and just the way he writes is incredibly thrilling, and I absolutely love this book. So if you're coming from the romance genre, there is tons of romantic high fantasy out there for you guys to choose from. So I wanted to give you guys a recommendation that is more about fantasy and world building rather than romance, but with some really good romantic elements to it as well. So for that, I'm gonna recommend to you guys Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. So this is an absolutely fantastic book with very like a lush world building that is very detailed, and one of those worlds that you can really just fall into and live for a while, but at the same time, it does have a lot of those elements to it that you would expect from a romance novel. So it's following a character named Phaedra, who is sold into indentured servitude as a child because she was born with a scarlet mote in her left eye. So the nobleman that she's sold to recognizes that for what it is because it means she feels pleasure and pain at the same time. So she's training to become basically a courtesan, but she's actually really a spy. It is a really interesting concept that I absolutely love. I'm actually due for a reread of this book, so I will probably be rereading it soon because I want to continue on with the series, but it's such a beautifully written book, and it's definitely perfect if you're typically a romance reader but want to dip your toes a bit into high fantasy. So the next genre that I want to base my recommendation off is contemporary fiction. So if you read a lot of adult contemporary fiction, this series may be for you. The reason why I say maybe as opposed to will be is contemporary fiction is very wide. There's a lot of different things that go on in contemporary fiction, but if you particularly like good family dynamics and social situations, then you're gonna love this series, and that's the Live Ship Trader series by Robin Hobb. The first book in this series is Ship of Magic. This is an absolutely fantastic series, definitely one of my favorite of all times, and probably my favorite series by Robin Hobb. The reason why I would recommend this is because it has very complex, interesting family dynamics and social situations that there are no winners and losers in. There's no easy solutions to all of the complex conflicts that happen in this story, and it just makes me so happy every time that I read it. This is definitely the book if you like family drama. So this series is set in Bingtown, and it has to do with the Bingtown traders. So kind of how this society works is they have the estate at home, and then they have the live ship. So they're basically merchants, and they get all of their merchandise through trading using their live ship, and the live ship is basically part of the family. It's a ship that can talk. That's kind of like the main magical element in this story. And the leader of the Vesrut family is Ephron Vesrut. He has 2 daughters, so no sons, but his wife and his older daughter Kefria kind of stay at the estate and run everything back home, while he and his younger daughter Althea are the ones that mainly travel with the live ship. So Althea has basically grown up on the shelf since she was little, but when her father dies, his will ends up leaving all of their assets to her sister and her husband Kyle, and Althea and Kyle don't really get wrong, and Althea thinks that the ship should be hers since she basically grew up on it and the crew respects her the way they should. So like that dynamic is just so fantastic. There's a lot more to this book other than that, but that dynamic is what really drew me into the book and to this story the first time I read it and made me absolutely fall in love with this series. The series also has really great world building. Like I said, there are talking ships in here, and there's a reason they're talking. Like there's more magic than just that as well, and it has some of the best, like really just subtle world building than you would expect. I absolutely love Robin Hobb and her writing, and I would definitely recommend this to new readers of the genre. If you are a fan of sci-fi, then I have a great recommendation for you, and that's The Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, the first book of which is Dragonflight. So this series is set on another planet in which there is this red dust that falls from the sky, and the red dust eats all organic matter, but there's this other species on this planet that resemble like your typical high fantasy dragon that you would expect, and the humans make a pact with this species so that they can get rid of this red dust. The dragons are actually really rare now. It's been quite a while now since the thread, is what they call it, has threatened their society, but it looks like it's gonna start falling again. So our main character, Lessa, has to find a way to bring the dragons back, or else they're gonna be completely doomed. I absolutely love the concept and the world building in this book. It also brings in some other tropes that I really like that I can't really talk about because that would be like crazy spoilers, but I absolutely love like some of the tropes that it brings in. I definitely love the more sci-fi aspects to the story, and there's also a lot of books in this series, and if you end up liking this as well, there are so many books in this series that you'll have tons and tons to read. So for all you sci-fi readers out there, I got one more for you guys. If you read a lot of sci-fi, but maybe you don't want to go so much into heroic fantasy, but you want to go a little bit closer to the grimdark side, I would recommend Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover. So the concept of this book is really interesting. It's about a man, Harry Michelson, kind of this actor and a superstar who ventures into the world of Arcana, and he plays a character named Kane. And Kane is this brutal murderer, basically, and Arcana is kind of like this almost high fantasy sort of world, but when he's there, he's an actor who's basically playing out these scenarios, and then it's sent back to Earth where people can relive his experience and everything that he was feeling when he was on Ancana. But Ancana is a real place, so he is kind of like the perfect anti-hero, and one day his estranged wife, who also plays a character in this other world, Palace Rill, goes missing, so he has to go and save her. This is a fantastic book that is just full of great politics on multiple levels, because there's the politics of Ancana, which are like very much high fantasy sort of politics. It feels like it's really in a high fantasy world, and then there's the real world politics of Earth that feels very much like your typical sci-fi novel. I absolutely love this book because of how it bends genres so well, and it definitely has a really interesting insight into grimdark as well, because the main character, Harry Michelson, or Kane, is kind of two different people, but he's also very much an anti-hero because he's both a murderer and a husband who just wants his wife back. So I absolutely love this book because of that and would highly recommend it. So if dystopian fiction is your thing, then you have got to try The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. So this is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and in case you couldn't tell by the title, yes, it's about the Earth basically breaking itself, and there are people in this world that can kind of control that, and they can save the people that are near them, but if they do that, then they kind of let out the secret that they're magical and are rounded up and kind of taken to this training center where they're not really free to be themselves anymore. I absolutely love the way this book is structured. It has some really interesting writing, and it's definitely a great adult high fantasy novel, but at the same time, it is very much a dystopian novel in some of the best ways possible, and I would highly recommend it to pretty much anyone, especially if you really love dystopian. So the last genre that I want to talk about is urban fantasy, which you would think as an urban fantasy reader, you wouldn't have a problem with high fantasy, but honestly, I think urban fantasy and high fantasy are generally very different. Personally, I'm not really a fan of urban fantasy. I generally don't like urban fantasy, but there is one urban fantasy series that reads so much like high fantasy that I can't help but love it, and that's the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. The first book in the series is Jade City. I absolutely love this series, and even though it is most definitely urban fantasy, it reads so much like high fantasy that I don't even realize that it's urban fantasy half the time. So in this world, the Greenbone Warriors use Jade to enhance their abilities, and that's where like the main magic of the story comes from. But what makes the series so great is how complex and filled out this world is. It really feels like you're sitting in this Asian society while you're reading this book, and it also has really complex and interesting political and social situations. There's really great family dynamics in this book as well, and this author is not scared to be hard on her characters. Like, she is so hard on her characters sometimes. Sometimes she's hard on the readers and what she does to the characters, and I absolutely love every second of it. This is by far one of my favorite urban fantasy series that I've ever read, and it definitely gives me those high fantasy feels that I expect because of how detailed and rich the world building is, while at the same time just having this really great plot with fantastic plot twists and really, really good fight scenes as well. This is definitely a series that I can't recommend more. I absolutely loved it and would highly recommend to any reader, especially if you're trying to get into more high fantasy. It could technically be high fantasy, but it really is more of an urban fantasy. So let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, because I would love to discuss with you guys. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you want to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.